Okay, Caleb, we're about to start. Okay, we're going to be filming this. The camera's on, so the presenters will stand up at the podium, but we do have the microphones on, so our voices will be captured.
Although they will not come out of the speakers, I should note that I have it turned down some to prevent feedback.
It's recording. Okay,
It
so.
is recording now.
Okay, so you need to speak up. And thank you all for coming tonight. This is a work session, a combined work session of the Design Review Board and the Planning Commission to go over version 3, which is the latest version. It's gone through a couple of versions with the stakeholder committee of the proposed form-based code, which includes a transfer of development rights ordinance within it for the Deerfield Route 9 area. As you know, the city did approve recently the planning study for the Deerfield Route 9 area, and as a result, this form-based code is the zoning that will go into place to implement that plan. And the city has hired Caleb Rassico from Tennell, Spangler, and Walsh, as well as Rick Preetz, who have helped us on this plan, and both of them have a presentation for you to bring you up to date on the latest version and to get your input. And then from here, the this version will then go on to a regular meeting of the Planning Commission for them to review and vote on it. And then after, subsequent to that in March, it will move on to the City Council for a work session by them, and then a meeting where they will have the opportunity to review and hopefully approve. So that's the process. Caleb is going to work us through the form-based code, and then Rick will work us through the TDR section of the ordinance as well. So Caleb, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Good evening, everyone. As Kathy mentioned, my name is Caleb Rossico, and I'm with TSW. And we've been working with the City of Milton and the Deerfield Highway 9 stakeholders for several months now to develop the form-based code you have before you. For those of you who have actually looked at the printed version, you'll notice that there are some words that are struck through or underlined. All of that represents as a change we've made from version 2 to version 3. We're trying to keep track of every change we make to any part of this code, so we have a record of why those were done. I wanted to start out very briefly, for those of you who have seen this presentation 8 times or more, with a quick overview of what we mean when we talk about form-based codes in the Deerfield area. The photos up here are really images that speak to the heart of the difference between form-based zoning and conventional zoning. Both of these images show 14 to 15,000 square foot CVS pharmacies. They both have 4 to 5 parking spaces per thousand, and they both are the exact same type of use. So on a zoning map, they would typically be shown up as red, regardless. But when you look at them, you'll see that they are very, very different. The one on the left is a conventional CVS, could be anywhere USA. The one on the right is a similar store that is more compatible with the neighborhood it is actually in. Happens to be in a area of Davidson, North Carolina, near Charlotte. The differences between these two stores really speaks to the heart of what is different about form-based coding. Form-based coding is focused primarily on the form of the building or what it looks like, as where conventional zoning is primarily focused on the use. And so when we talk about form-based coding tonight, it's important to recognize that everything I'm going to speak about intends to create the vision and the plan for the Deerfield area that emerged from the LCI. Now, form-based coding, as I said, focuses on the shape of buildings. That could mean the layout of a neighborhood. It could mean the architecture of a building, the placement of buildings on their lot, and the design of streets and public spaces, things like parks, squares, and the like. Now, it should not be confused with design regulations, which are purely advisory. This is, in fact, going to be a legally binding law with specific provisions that require such. Now, one of the other big differences about form-based coding is it tends to use graphics. So when you've looked at the code, you probably have noticed that there are a lot of pictures. These pictures are intended to highlight or explain something in the code, but they are, of course, never legally defensible. They are always backed up by text or words or charts, which is critical. And of course, one of the final differences of form-based coding versus conventional zoning is that it really is tied to what is called a regulating plan, which is essentially a subset of the official zoning map that takes the vision of an area plan, in this case the LCI, and codifies it. It codifies it in a way that ensures that things like parks, open spaces, new streets, and different intensities of uses are in fact a zoning requirement. Now, the proposed form-based code before you is, again, primarily intended to accomplish the legalization of the LCI vision. To that end, it accomplishes several key provisions of that. It creates new open spaces, streets, and trails. It provides mixed-use development opportunities, and it will grow the tax base in Milton. So it is intended to direct development intensity to this one particular area. At the same time, some of the other goals of it are to simplify the process, to protect existing neighborhoods. You'll notice that there's a lot of text that talks about buffers and height transitions and the like, to create certainty for developers so that everyone knows what's expected and what is going to happen in the code, whether it is a resident or a business or a property owner, and at the same time creating a little bit more flexibility than would otherwise be provided. And then finally, two important components. We tried to create this in a way that would avoid downzoning. So all of the density and scale and height permissions that we talk about tonight have preserved current entitlements of properties or expanded them. And of course, some of them have incorporated the TDR component, which Rick will talk about. Now, the form-based code is based on what is called the SMART code, which is essentially a free code that can be downloaded and calibrated to reflect the local needs of a community. The SMART code is based on an idea of what is called the transect, which essentially says that all types of habitat range from complete rural and wilderness to completely urban, and that all of the different kinds of communities that we have really fall somewhere in between. This is a similar type of code to the one that was adopted in June last year in Crabapple. So it also has a lot of the same graphics, the same verbiage, but of course, as a locally calibrated SMART code, it does have a lot of things that are very, very different and created especially for Deerfield. And what are the primary reasons for those differences? Well, obviously, one is that Deerfield today has very different zoning than Crabapple had a year and a half ago. It has fairly high intensity development in the actual Deerfield office park. It has several commercial and multifamily complexes along Highway 9. And then it has more rural areas along Cogburn Road that are actually zoned AG2. One of the other challenges to putting together this code is that we had to look at not only the underlying zoning, but also a series of overlays. There is the State Route 9 overlay, which has very specific design parameters that we need to incorporate. And even more challenging, if you will, was incorporating the private covenants and agreements that the Deerfield community has. We had to make sure that we don't outlaw something that is actually a requirement of the Deerfield covenants. Because, of course, those covenants will remain in perpetuity while the underlying zoning will be replaced by this code. And so as we looked at the existing zoning and we looked at the SMART code, we essentially determined that of this entire range of sort of rural to urban transects, we would really have four of them. We would have T2 or agricultural in the areas on Cogburn Road that are zoned agricultural. And then we'd have a series of T3, T4, T5, and T6 really tying into whatever the underlying zoning was. And I'll explain what those are in a moment. In addition, we had one location, a neighborhood up in the north part of Highway 9 that for some reason was put in the LCI area, even though it was part of a much larger planned development. So we created what is called a special district there that incorporated the current zoning rights. So as I mentioned, we looked at the existing zoning, we looked at the permitted by right intensity, we looked at the LCI plan, and we essentially converted that into the draft regulating plan version 3 that you have before you. As you can see, some of the big ideas, and I apologize it's not that readable, but some of the big ideas are to concentrate the highest intensity development, or T6, in the Deerfield area, to transition down into the existing multifamily areas to the north with what we call T5 limited zoning, and then to preserve the general lower scale but fairly intense still development patterns of Highway 9, and as we go towards the neighborhood, stepping down additionally in intensity. The regulating plan also incorporates some of the trails that were recommended in the LCI and some of the new street connections that were recommended into the LCI as well, which you can refer to on your specific map, and I'll highlight a few of. The general structure of the code is identical to the Crabapple form-based code in that it includes 6 articles. Those articles range from sort of procedural and administrative to the very specific and detailed as we go forward. The first section is the general instructions part of the code, which talks about the intent. It talks about how this code ties back to the LCI and the comp plan. It talks about how definitions are addressed. There are certain definitions that we had to create that were not in the general City of Milton zoning code, and those are incorporated. And it talks about, as I mentioned earlier, what are those transect zones or special district. Essentially defines them so that we have an ability later on in the code to actually use them. It also talks quite a bit about process, and this is again one of, I think, the hallmarks of this particular code. It creates a new classification of variation within the Deerfield area, one that has already been created for Crabapple, but is not generally applied citywide. This is called a warrant. A warrant is a type of administrative variance that allows some of the more complicated design details to be varied based on certain criteria. And then everything that can't be varied through that way has to go to the usual Planning Commission and variance process. One of the other things this code does is it talks about how all of the architectural and review criteria in it, except for single family, have to go to the DRB, which is, again, in keeping what the current protocol is. Now, the code also talks about how density is calculated within the Deerfield area. And again, we tried to base this on the general structure that we used in Crabapple, again, because it doesn't make sense if the city is going to a form-based code method to have completely different processes everywhere. So it talks about the creation of what is called a building unit. A building unit is essentially an amount of stuff that can be converted into 1 housing unit, 2 lodging units, or 2,250 square feet of other type of floor area, office, retail, commercial, and the like. These are base parameters that are sort of implicit to how we think about density within this particular code, and it lays out those. Article 2 of the code talks about the regulating plan that I just highlighted on very quickly. It says that the regulating plan is mandatory in Deerfield, but we know that whenever zoning is created, we always need to create a potential mechanism for variations from it. So it also creates what is called an infill regulating plan that says a developer who has a large enough property, a very significant, sizable project, can elect to, of their own accord, to essentially go through a rezoning process and prepare what is called an infill regulating plan. And then within all of those, it gives the community development director the ability to make very, very minor modifications to the regulating plan based on site conditions. So, for example, if there is a street that is shown on the regulating plan, the community development director can move it up to 300 feet as long as it is still substantially similar. We did that because, as all of you know, whenever you plan at sort of a macro level, you're not going to anticipate every site condition, and we wanted to give developers the ability to actually make a interpretation of the code, if you will, that works once their engineering is done. So that is also within here. Now, one of the other things that this code does that I think is very different from Crabapple, but really critical to what Deerfield and Highway 9 are today, is it talks about streets, and then it talks about different types of streets. If you read the LCI plan, you'll notice that some of the streets in Deerfield are intended to be more walkable, more pedestrian-oriented than others. And so we wanted to create a mechanism for reflecting that, some of the streets will always be different. So what we did is we created what are called A-grid and B-grid streets. Essentially what this means is that the A-grid streets are going to be your major corridors that are really important to the aesthetics of the area. Things like State Route 9, things like Webb Road, things like Deerfield Parkway, Morris Road, and the like. But then we also know that there are some existing streets, which often tend to be private, that do provide some connectivity, but they're fronted by parking lots, or they're much less visually appealing. So those are also mapped out, and again, they tend to be things like the drive island in front of Walmart, or some of the internal streets that the city has required as part of different shopping center developments in the community. Article 2 also talks about the requirements for that infill regulating plan process that I mentioned. Again, very similar to the base regulating plan you see, but it lays out the tools developers have to use. And then finally, it talks quite a bit about buffer requirements. We had a lot of residents who were part of the stakeholder committee that informed this group, and needed to make sure that we incorporated all of the existing city buffer requirements into the code. So once we talked about overall form of the code, we've talked about the regulating plan, we finally get into what are the true regulations, if you will. This particular set addresses what we call public standards, which are basically the design of the roadways and the design of the parks in the community. Within this part of the code, it talks about the creation of the new thoroughfares, again, per the regulating plan. It talks about the provision of rear alleys in certain areas and not in others. And it talks about the ability to do some new smaller lots that actually front on green spaces or parks as opposed to streets. And I believe there are some just north of here where Webb Road and Deerfield Parkway intersect in that particular new development. It talks about vehicular lanes, which are really the design of the roadways and subject to the Public Works Review. It talks about bicycle facilities, making sure that we've, again, incorporated the bike trails and paths that were recommended in the LCI. And then it talks very specifically about public frontage, which sounds like a complicated term, but it really is just the streetscape. What does it look like? So we go into a lot of detail about, on this particular street, you must do a street tree and a sidewalk of this width, both for the existing roadways that are in the area, again, matching what is there or what was in the LCI, and then more importantly, how you also design the new streets. Also part of the public frontage part of the code is incorporation of some of the other existing characteristics that I think make this area unique, one of which is a mandatory 20-foot landscape strip along Highway 9 and Windward. As part of that, it also incorporates provisions for a mandatory fence, again, something that has already been done, but we wanted to incorporate in this code as well based on the plan. And then the design of parks and open spaces. Now, this code is very different from what the current regulations in Deerfield are because it does two fundamental things. It creates a 5% requirement for major new developments up to 4 acres and a 10% requirement for developments over, or should I say, from 4 to 8 and then over 8. And then it talks very specifically about how these spaces must be designed. So it comes up with a series of different kinds of things, parks, playgrounds, squares, plaza, and goes into a lot of detail about their specific design. The idea being that in Deerfield, the LCI plan really focuses on public space, and we needed to have a mechanism for ensuring that the design of that space, whether or not it's actually public property or not, is designed in a way that is accessible to the community. And article, should I say section 3.5, addresses how that's done. And then finally, we get into section or article 4 of the code, which is really most analogous to current zoning. And by that, I mean once you've laid out your neighborhood, once you've put in your streetscape, you really need to know what happens on the individual lot, and this is controlled by Article 4. It talks about the submittal requirements when you are going to file a permit for a lot within this area. It talks about how nonconformities are treated, and by that we mean both nonconforming uses and nonconforming buildings. And it talks about, in a purely illustrative way, how nonconformities can become conforming as new development occurs over time and with changes. As the part of the code that is really most analogous to conventional zoning, it also talks about where a building sits on the lot. So there's language about different setbacks and different transect zones, different lot coverage, different building heights, and the like. And then, again, we tried to incorporate the current unique characters of Deerfield, so we even came up with a special provision that reflects the current requirements on Highway 9 that allow for the creation of variable big box retail setbacks based on the size. So, for example, if you think about where the Target is, they were built with a different setback than the smaller buildings that are on the front of the property. And so this will allow that type of development to continue for the most part along Highway 9. And then finally, the final sort of design piece of buildings that it talks about is the attention given to the relationship between building and street. So it talks about all of the different ways that a building and a sidewalk can interact. Again, some of those are very urban, such as a stoop, like what we have across the street here at the townhomes, or a porch. But it also does allow, as I've mentioned, parking and similar existing characteristics in certain areas. And then Article 4 also is where we finally get into use. I mentioned earlier that form-based coding does not throw out use, and we certainly don't do that. But what we do in this particular code is come up with a variety of use provisions that vary based on what transect zone you're in. So in the more residential transect zones, the T2, the T3, and T4, you really can't do much commercial at all. As we're in the more urban and commercial transect zones, T5 and T6, you can do a lot of commercial. And those particular provisions are laid out in Article 4. Now, all of those pieces go together to, again, reaffirm the idea that we are going to have different character areas or transect zones in Deerfield as development occurs. In the areas that are T2, these areas will remain relatively low density. They'll have 1 unit an acre, which is analogous to AG1 zoning. They will have large buildings that are set back on the lot and surrounded by green space, and they will be exclusively residential, again, analogous to AG1 zoning. In the T3 areas, which are slightly more urban, you'll continue to have a primarily single-family development pattern. The lots will be a bit smaller. The density will be about 3 units per acre by right, up to 6 with TDR. And again, the buildings will be set back, not extremely urban again. In T4, things start to become very different. T4 is absolutely what the development pattern could look like in some of the new subdivisions that are in the vicinity of the Deerfield area. T4, again, is primarily a 3-story district. It provides for townhomes or small lot single-family homes, and in very specific locations, it even allows for home offices and small corner commercial uses. The mapping of T4 is fairly limited in Deerfield because, again, we don't have a lot of that type of development today, but we did want to create a provision in the code where it could be provided in the future. And then as of our stakeholder meeting a week and a half ago, we actually created yet another zone that is, generally speaking, based on T4. We got a lot of feedback from the stakeholders that there's a small area west of Highway 9 on Webb Road that is actually zoned commercial today, but should have a more T4 character, if you will. For this area, we created a special subzone called T4 Open, which is exactly identical to the T4 General, except in two primarily ways. One, because it is commercial today, it allows commercial uses anywhere. And then two, because of the specific location of that T4 open zone and because of its proximity to Highway 9, it allows you to go up to 4 stories versus the general 3 standard condition. And then finally, T5 and T6 are really very similar zones. They're both fairly in high intensity mixed use districts. T5 is limited to the Highway 9 corridor itself, and T6, which is the highest intensity zone, is immediately adjacent to sort of Georgia 400 where we are now. Now, one of the other interesting things that T6 does is if you look at the LCI plan, you will notice that it calls for a transition in building height from Highway 9 to Georgia 400. Michelle had the great pleasure, Robin with the city, of pulling all of the existing zoning approvals within this area. And what we found was that there are a wide variety of current by right zoning entitlements in terms of building heights. Some areas are only limited to 4 floors. Some in the city of Milton are 7, and then some immediately adjacent in Alpharetta are actually 10 to 20 stories. And so we tried to keep this in mind as we developed the final sort of design provision, if you will, of the T6 zone, which, although it's hard to see, essentially achieves a setback or step, as I mentioned, with the 4 floors of T5 on Highway 9, a 12-story zone along Deerfield, where we are today, over to Morris Road, and then finally a 16-story building height zone, essentially on the Verizon campus immediately adjacent to Georgia 400. And generally speaking, all of these incorporate the same basic standards of mandatory screening for things like dumpsters, trash areas, mechanical features, and the like. It incorporates the same basic architectural and stormwater standards for new development, the same standards for interparcel access and off-street parking and the location of parking, again, with the exception of some unique provisions on Highway 9. Comparable standards in terms of landscape and the planting of trees and the prohibition of invasive species in the community, and lighting as well are also addressed. And then finally, Article 4 talks a little bit about some things that I would characterize in more of the architectural or actual building design. Again, we've talked about the layout of communities, the streetscape, the placement of buildings on lots. Article 4's final few sections actually talk about more design-specific details. It comes up with some pretty detailed standards for drive-thrus and gasoline stations based on some of the history within this particular community. It incorporates the current design standards of the sign code, and then it comes up with I think a 2 to 3 page section of architectural standards that take the base in the current Highway 9 overlay and go into a little bit more detail. It talks about 360-degree architecture, meaning making sure that the buildings look good from all sides. The composition of the street, meaning of the facade, meaning what does the building look like from the front. The color standards that you currently have in the community, the roof standards that you currently have. But unlike Crabapple, no particular style standards, which for those of you who aren't architects means that as long as you meet the materials and the general layouts, you can do a building that is very traditional, sort of contemporary, or anything in between, but you do have to meet the material standards that'll provide a fairly common design aesthetic throughout. And then finally, the last 2 sections of the form-based code are really more administrative components. Article 5 is the standards, which means all of the tables that I just showed you. And Article 6 is actually the definitions. So when you read the form-based code and you see something capitalized, that has a very specific meaning at the end. So I know I've talked to you quite a bit about what the parts of the code are. Would love to answer any questions you might have about specifics if you've had the opportunity to read it in advance or anything that might have piqued your interest. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Caleb. I didn't introduce Bob Buscemi, who's sitting at our table, by the way, for you planning commission members. I don't know if you've all met Bob. He's our city architect. He's works with the department and works with the DRB board, and so I asked him to join us this evening as well. So, thank you, Bob. Okay, questions. This isn't clear to everyone, I'm sure. I'm sure you've
Yeah.
got questions, so come on.
I talked fast, and there's a lot to read, but
Yeah, we're here to answer them.
I had a question,
Yes, ma'am?
just on the discussion, you just were talking about the Highway 9 area, which I'm actually in that area, that there weren't going to be any set standards on buildings. Kind of wondering about that.
On the style.
Yeah.
It doesn't require style, but if you turn to that particular section, it does talk about materials, so you can't do vinyl. You have to do certain masonry construction, which is the current requirement. It essentially takes what you currently have today as the current Highway 9 requirements and adds a bit more standards to them. So it says that even though you don't have to do a certain style, you do have to meet some basic requirements. And I'll just read some of those.
And Caleb, it also has to go through the design review
And it does
board.
have to go before the DRB. Yeah.
That doesn't change.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that, why it went that direction. Was that the LCI recommend? I mean, where did that come from? Because I actually helped with the first Highway 9 overlay, and the problem that they have in the Highway 9 area is, Fulton pretty much, there were no standards. They just came out and built a lot of weird-looking stuff, and it really is somewhat ugly. And it, as we go down the road and people start changing out, I mean, it seems like it would be better to have some sort of, standard around, if you look at Crabapple, there's some standard over there around how things look. And I think it seems like kind of need the same thing over there. I'm not sure we're going to go in the direction that people were hoping. That's my question.
There,
Come down to an architectural feel.
Yeah.
Of what you want to establish as a city.
Right.
In a
Well,
particular
we're the
area.
gateway to the city, Highway 9. You come
Right.
off 400, you're in Milton. It's like, Alfred into Milton, and here we are. So it's like,
And actually based on some of the feedback that George had given at the steering committee meeting, you'll notice that page 24 of the code has a fairly robust set of new architectural standards that we came up with. Again, they don't regulate style, but they do talk, for example, about emphasizing the corners of buildings. They talk about minimum percentages of glass on the front of buildings so that you don't have blank walls. And one of the things that they do that is new is talk about facade articulation, if you will, different recesses, different building setbacks, and the like. And then the provision, again, in a very general sense of windows, arches, balconies, and other architectural details as being required, but we don't say, buildings must be Greek revival or buildings must be neoclassical, because what is, especially in Deerfield, I mean, I'm not even sure what you would call that, 90s office park modernism. But the idea was to give a developer enough flexibility while doing something that, from my mind, would be a step above what you have today.
okay, so the hope is that, let me make sure I understand this, that architects who are going to put something like this together, that they come up with something creative, different, and then hopefully that we'd be wild.
I hope that I've given the DRB enough stuff to go after. There's a lot of very specific standards, but there are some standards that are, I hope there's not an attorney in here, but that are somewhat vague. For example, and they're vague because they're in the current Highway 9. Things like buildings, again, shall incorporate windows, arches, balconies, and the like. So, the idea is that that'll provide some direction. and generally speaking, we also came up with some more standards against blank walls as part of this. But I would love if you have anything else. Again, it's a fine line between
Defensive.
creating something that's flexible for what Deerfield is versus Crabapple, which was extremely historic. And if you can think of an area of the Atlanta region, I'd be more than happy to look at the code of that and see if they have done anything. But these general provisions that we created are similar to what you would see on Roswell Road in Sandy Springs, where, believe it or not, they actually did an overlay with design standards about 10 years ago, and so the new development's a bit better. But again, they're not Crabapple. They're hybrid.
Well, I mean, I don't think we're not Crabapple over there either, but I know people don't want to see, cinder block,
Yeah, you can't
ugly,
do that.
and, they want something, kind of trendy, creative, that is, a hallmark of the city versus, okay, this is like a mishmash of, I don't know what's going on here. I mean, there's just no continuity with anything. It just looks like haphazard design, really, if even design. I mean, it's unfortunate that, that big area, which is, part of the city, ended up like that. But it is what it is, and hopefully it'll change.
Well, part of the benefit that we have really, because most developers, builders that come before a municipality for whatever varied boards these different municipalities have, they're essentially trying to sell that municipality on their deal. And so at that point, that becomes a place where the municipality itself, through whatever boards, whether it be the design review board, be the city staff or council or whoever, that if they know the public is looking for a particular trend or style of an area, they may impart that information to a builder or a developer that's going to develop it to what we're trying to see that's going to go there. And you'll find that most of the builders, well, if they really want to build that project, they're going to be they will listen and try to comply to some of it, or if not, because obviously we stand the right to, as a municipality, to approve their project or not.
Well, I think here's the challenge. I'm not sure people know what they want, but they don't want what's there now. So, what are some options or opportunities, I think, we understand we're not Crabapple, okay, but what is it and what should it look like? And I'm not sure anyone has a concept, but I think they wanted to see something totally different. I mean, I can tell you that.
I don't doubt it's hard to build big boxes.
I think to your point, we've all in Milton over the years been very good at defining what we don't want and not what we do want. And I think what Caleb's saying is that the language that's been added into here is to try and preclude those things that we don't want without defining what we do want. It does leave room to do that. But I mean, if you think about Quantum Bank as an example, Quantum Bank wouldn't be allowable under this. Something like that would not be acceptable. The one thing, Caleb, that you said, that maybe for the sake of clarity, since we've got both groups here, is there is a requirement in here that everything's got to go through the design review board before it gets land disturbance permits and so on. But the design review board's role isn't changing; it's still advisory. So while they can, and I guess that's the thing that still bothers me, is that the developer, as long as they're staying within this, can put up pretty much whatever they want to do. The design review board can make comments, and those comments may or may not be, let's say, enforced. But the design review board doesn't have the ability to say, sorry, you can't do that. You got to go back to the drawing board.
I think
Well-
there's a bit of a latitude, and maybe Angela.
Yeah, Angela, why don't you respond, because you're the one that carries through with that.
There are two parts to it. We have, the way we've been doing it for Crabapple, for example, when a developer comes in, we sit down with Bob and Kathy, and we go over his plans, and we see, step by step, and make sure he's meeting the criteria for the form-based code. We see whether or not he needs any warrants. If he does need warrants, which usually there's going to be something they need, that actually gives us leverage. We can ask them, okay, we'll let you have some slack on this, but you're going to do this, this, and this for us. So that's step one. Bob's not going to approve it. Kathy's not going to approve it until we think it take it to the design review board for their review also. And Bob has now joined the design review board. It's kind of an extra set of eyes. And the design review board has to give them a certificate of endorsement. So they can't get that permit until Bob's happy, Kathy's happy, and the design review board's happy. So that's pretty.
Where's that requirement arising from?
Whereas what we're going.
The certificate of an endorsement from the design review board.
It's in the ordinance.
That's always been.
It's always been there. Yeah.
But it doesn't govern aesthetics.
It does cover aesthetics.
That's
what the design review.
That's what the design
Oh,
review board. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
That's it.
Plant some nice shrubs.
Yeah, I have a question.
Steve,
This
you
is-
go ahead,
yeah.
Steve, you had a question,
This
yeah.
may be more for Kathy. We've got a draft and a draft 2 and draft 3. What is the process going forward? Is this get reviewed again? Does it
Yes,
go to
it's
the
ever
board,
ever
or-
evolving, and that, we had a stakeholder committee that we
Yeah.
worked with, and we had
Yeah.
several meetings. George represented the planning commission on
Yeah.
that, and I'm not sure who, I guess we didn't have a DRB representative, although I think, but in any event, it's gone through the stakeholder committee, and several changes have been made that we track. And so now what you've got here is a brand-new version, which is version 3.
Okay.
And so tonight is a workshop meeting for the DRB, which is more of an informational meeting for you, because it actually will now go through to the Planning Commission, who will actually act on it. And so this is their workshop with the consultants here. And then at their regularly scheduled meeting, which is next month, they will meet to act on this, hopefully act on it next month. Well, they can always
We'll
defer.
act on it.
And then once they vote on it, it then goes to the city council. And if they act on it next month, in March, there'll be the work session in March. Consultants will be there. So you see, it may be now version 4, because when it gets to the planning commission after, if you have any comments, DRB, planning commission, or next month at the planning commission meeting, we may end up with a version 4 that gets to the city council. The city council will look at version 4, they'll have the work session. They may make more changes. We'll end up with a version 5 that gets to the final meeting, the third Monday of March, for action by the city council. That is the
All right. Part
process. Yes.
2 question is this form-based coding, is this part of the overlay district, or is this a separate, I guess, coding?
It's a new overlay district, and it incorporates all the others. The others are now go by the wayside,
Okay,
and
so-
this is a new one. in
So
place.
the Deerfield overlay will go away,
Right.
and this will replace it.
That's right, with the covenants from Deerfield that are in perpetuity.
Okay.
So they've been incorporated in here.
Yeah.
And then to the extent that we could take the Route 9 design guidelines and whatnot, they were also incorporated to some extent and then
Okay.
enhanced. So that's the process, but this will supersede, just like it did in Crabapple.
Yeah.
There was an existing Crabapple overlay. When the new one came in, the other one ceased to exist. Same thing here.
While you've been talking, I've been trying to think of some things that we could put in the version 4 that might address it. There are 2 provisions that I think might go a ways towards preventing what you don't want and starting to define what you do. I've seen communities that, and I'm not trying to be too technical, but they prohibit what are called spandrel buildings, which are essentially, if you think of the buildings that are all glass with just a band of what you have out here across the street. So I've seen communities that have actually prohibited that above the first floor. I've also seen communities that, in conjunction with that.
Robin wasn't talking about across the street.
No,
She's
I'm
talking
talking
about
right
this
here.
building.
Right here, yeah, actually. Yeah, absolutely, this building, where you just have a continuous row of glass with a little bit of foundation and glass above. It's typical 80s office buildings. Yes, sir?
I'm just thinking of process-wise, being on the DRB for about a year now. We get anything from tearing down a house to an office building and what have you. And typically, we get, Angela prepares the packages and we get it, a couple of 3 days in advance and what have you. we're lucky with all the things that we have to do to open it up, a half hour before
Sure.
the meeting.
Yep.
Because this seems to be something special, and certainly is probably not worthy of a half-hour review prior to making a decision and what have you. Is there anything that, if it is in this overlay or form-based coding area, that will come with, review and guidance and recommendations from staff prior to being submitted to the DRB?
And that's what we've been doing with crabapple.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
crabapple, we've
Okay.
gotten
Uh,
some, and they've been pre-reviewed,
Yeah,
like those.
okay.
Because in crabapple, we can do single-family homes as well, too, So
Right.
we have done everything. Everything that has come through that wants a building permit in crabapple must see Bob and I first. It goes to the DRB if it's commercial. Single-family homes are exempt from DRB, but they're not exempt from Bob and I. So we have been reviewing them. And there's only really been one commercial, and that's the flower shop on Mayfield Road. Has it come through yet, or?
Yeah, we see.
Okay, yeah, so that's the only one. Bob and I had something like 4 or 5 meetings, with them before you got to see it.
Yeah.
And we really significantly
It was also
modified that.
the clustered townhomes.
Oh, the
there.
townhomes, that's right. Yes, you saw the townhomes. And we also
Or where?
reviewed that.
Crabapple.
Yeah, the.
2 sets of those came
the-
through.
The Brayburn ones.
Right.
Yeah, John
Yeah,
Whelan homes,
right,
yeah.
yes.
So, if it's more than a single-family home, you'll see it. But just know, we have seen everything, and we have touched it first,
Yeah.
before it gets to you.
This one seems to have a little more latitude,
Yeah,
than-
because it's not historic. Historic is easy to find, colonial,
Crab
Queen
apple.
Anne,
Right.
but here, this is suburban. How do you define suburban
Yeah.
architecture?
Yeah.
I don't know,
You know it when you see it, right?
Another
I guess
thing,
The question I would, is there any way to do, I don't know if this was discussed at some of the meetings with some of the folks who were on the, like particularly Highway 9, not so much Deerfield, but maybe so, I don't know, because I know we've got more office space in there, but some sort of kind of future rendering around, here's where we think we'd like to go as things start turning over, which, is
Yeah.
starting to happen. We'd rather have this than that. To start kind of building a look and feel, because we don't have one.
and I think the design guidelines that you have do some of that, correct? And the LCI work?
The LCI
Yeah.
work does.
I did a survey that had a lot of cool stuff in it, the online survey.
Yeah.
I mean, there was lots of great
Yeah,
examples in there, I thought.
Yeah, Robin, go ahead.
Well, when we did do the guidelines, we did do a visual survey, and, most of it was 3-story buildings, which right now we don't allow 3-story buildings along Highway 9. And it was, up to the front. There were a lot of things that we really tried to incorporate into the overlay district when we did a fairly large revision to it based on that, project that we did a couple of years ago. But I think, I would agree, well, first of all, I just want to clarify that single family will not be reviewed by
Yeah.
anybody, okay?
That's
I
right.
don't want to get confused with crabapple.
That's right, yes.
Right.
Except for crabapple?
Right, crabapple, those guys are.
So no single family, so townhomes would be, because they're attached, multifamily. So I just want to make sure that you understand it, it does not come under the form-based code, single family detached for Deerfield Highway 9, okay? What she's referring to is in crabapple, they are, which is pretty significant. I don't know, I think that it really is a lot of the responsibility of the DRB, and now that we have Bob to assist in his, experience and wisdom, to really make and I think what Angela was starting to say was to make a B project an A project. And I think through all these different processes, that it can happen. And, so, I think we can achieve that through, and even with these more stringent regulations.
Caleb, do any of the other codes that you've written or seen, do they have examples? I think what you're getting at is like good examples of architecture that you'd rather see, just to give a developer sort of a starting point? Is that what you're trying to do?
Well, there were some examples like Virginia, a couple of areas in there. I know they were showing what parts of the country and some of the design aspects. And, I think those are things that people can get their head around.
Mhm.
You know, if you look at one building and go, well, it looks great for the one building, but what does that look like, you know, if we start changing the whole thing? You know, as things start, you know, getting sold and bought by other folks who want to renovate, you know, and we'd like it to change.
Yeah.
When it changes hands, I mean, I think that's the goal is people want to see not the garbage that's there.
Yeah.
That, you know, if somebody's going to reinvest, you know, let's see about making some changes.
Yeah.
They're going to renovate.
And that is covered, right? I mean, if somebody's,
Oh, legal non-conforming, yeah. We put it at, I believe, the current provisions, which is at 50% of value.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Is that pretty standard, or is that something that...
I deferred to whatever the city of Milton
Wants
had
to
at
do.
their, as their basis.
Is it-
Yeah.
Legal non-conforming.
Why are we not doing single-family homes? I mean, I know there's
That's only
not
for
a
the
lot of land,
modification,
but there is
the
some.
transfer of
And
property.
I know
By
some
bond, that's for the
areas right across from Cricket Creek.
Yeah,
Well,
well,
we care about what's going to be over there. I can tell you that in a big way.
Yeah, that's
The whole neighborhood will come
yeah,
out.
well, maybe,
Just
you know,
warning.
when we did the, it was the planning commission who drove that point through. When the form-based code for crabapple went to the planning commission said, hey, the residential area is such an important part of crabapple, there's so much of it, that it really needs a review. And if you leave it out of the review, you know, there's not that much really to review to create that village you're trying to do. So that when we went to the council, we brought that suggestion forward, that recommendation, and they agreed to it as well. And that's really the first time in the city that single-family homes have had design review. But they left it at the department level, so it doesn't go to DRB, but Bob and I do the review. So I suppose when we move this one through, this might be a recommendation, if you're interested, that we could ask the council to go through the planning commission and discuss that, and then go on to say, you know, do the same thing as you did in crabapple. At least have the department director review it, or the DRB, however you want to structure it. I mean, we can move
Yeah,
that
'cause
forward.
there's still some, you know, some lots around Belterre area that I think they would probably be pretty interested to make sure that's going to fit better with, you know, their whole area down that street. And I know there's some people who have a lot of feelings in that area, and you know, there's some fill-in areas, and I think people are going to care what. Now, some of it's AG or commercial, but there are still some
I
that are
don't
still.
think that goes.
This doesn't go that far north. That's a separate,
Potentially.
well, yeah.
Not yet.
Yeah.
I have a few other, well, can I
Yeah.
actually address?
yeah, it only makes it up to
The
Bethany
thought
Bend.
before-
Only makes, but now, we're doing a planning study to catch the rest of the area.
Okay.
And then once we do the planning study, we'll come back and put the zoning in place, so
Okay,
you're a little
that'll
ahead.
include the Bethany Bend down to Morse Road? That part?
Yes, and up to the county
And
line.
then-
But no, it won't, but it's a narrow strip along Highway 9.
It's just narrow.
It doesn't
Not-
go down to Morris Road.
Oh, it doesn't? Is that Deerfield, that part?
No, it just, are you talking about the one of Bethany,
No, she's going the
Where
other way.
Belterre is.
This
Oh,
right
on
the other
here
side
where
of
it comes
Highway
off
9.
and goes down to Mars.
So what is that part of?
Belterre is right.
I think most of that is,
That's
isn't that wetlands in there? So that's really why it wasn't.
One of these. I
It's
know
this
that,
one right
yeah.
here. That's where I
Well,
live.
there's been a whole mishmash of stuff in.
Being on the north side of Bethany Bend.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's some undeveloped AG1 that just have single-family lots
Mhm.
that they're, I don't know what that's supposed to be.
Well, and then you've
Yeah.
got
Yes,
transportation flow issue because the new development, that's gonna be off Morse
Yes.
Road, off 400 and the exit. I mean, I don't know, there needs to be some plans on that.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
I
that will
know
all be planned as part of
That's
that
like-
interchange, yeah,
that's
because
gonna
that's a
be
big
a
time
traffic
impact.
nightmare.
yeah.
May I throw something out for
Yes.
feedback really quickly? That would, I think, address some of it in terms of architecture. I know you can't see this, but I'll pass it around. It's my really awful quick drawing. But we've also worked in some communities where they wanted to prevent what I'll call the box building, the building that is just boxy and has no architectural character. A way that we can code very easily, again, we won't address style, is we could say buildings must have facades with these parts. If you think of classical architecture, They usually have a base or a bottom, and that is addressed in this code by what are called the private frontage requirements. You have to create a certain ground floor. But then they tend to have the ground floor differentiated from the upper floors, what is called the shaft, and then they tend to have some kind of topping at the top or a capital. This three-part scenario can apply to a classical mid-rise in downtown Atlanta, or it can apply to a fairly modern but nice-looking office building like at Post Riverside or something, if you're familiar with that. We could come up with language on that. Again, it would give developers a lot of flexibility, but what it would prevent is a monolithic building without any detail. At the same time, we've also had a lot of success with saying in those upper floors, your windows have to be in a fairly regular pattern, so you don't have a mishmash. That, again, allows you to have architecture that could be modern, could be traditional, but it doesn't look bad, which I know is very arbitrary and subjective. But if you'd like, I can come up with some additional standards that would, I think, improve the quality even more.
What's some pictures as examples and things?
Yeah, pictures would not be in the code.
No, but for us to look at. Or
Yeah, and I actually gave Michelle
To
about
describe different massing.
Exactly.
500 photos
We're gonna
of
look at different massings,
buildings
then
Yeah.
you want
to use in the image survey for the Highway 9 study. But I will add that based on your
That'd be
comments.
great. Yeah,
Okay.
I think, I don't think, we don't want to restrict, but we just want something to
You know, one of the things, if you go back for a history of building houses, in the 60s we had just, utilitarian-based rectangle boxes, and the houses had no three-dimensional type of look to them. But the same thing can be said towards commercial buildings, and what you're really looking for, I suspect, is in some form a three-dimensional look on a wall or a building from the road, so it doesn't look like it's just one big slab that's put up. And I don't know if that's the right way to refer to it, but we're building subdivisions. We're looking for not repeating a three-dimensional look, but we're looking for depth in the building itself, where the building looks like it's got depth to it when you look at it from the face.
Yeah.
I have to look at more carefully on those provisions that you wrote in here. And what I'll try to do is apply them. And I'll start to apply them, and then I'll challenge them and see how it looks and show it to y'all and see,
Okay.
is this really the kind of forms that we'd be looking for? The best way to do this is to take it, start applying it to particular sites, and let's see how it rolls out. I think it would be a good illustration for everybody to see how things are starting to look from Massey.
Because while she's talking, I'm sitting there going, how attractive can you make a Walmart? Really? How attractive can you make?
The one up on
The
North
one
9
on
is
Highway
way more
9 in
attractive than the one
Forsyth.
right here.
That's because North Fulton did that one.
Yeah.
Or Fulton did that one.
No,
We
Forsyth.
actually worked
It's the
with
one up in
Walmart
Forsyth, yeah.
many years.
It's a nice Walmart.
We
Oh, I
forced
know.
Walmart to put in more entrance doors and make it look like a series of buildings
Right.
rather than one
Right.
building.
Yep.
So
Goes
if I
back to
showed you a
three-dimensional.
picture of some of the Walmarts we've done, you would never believe they were Walmarts.
Right.
Because they look like 10 different stores with all
Right.
storefronts.
How much
and
more
whatnot.
expensive though is that? I mean, is that
Well,
why
they
developers
fight
avoid
it, but
it?
we worked
Yeah.
with them on it. and
One-time
they said,
expense and
okay.
they're done. Make
I
it
mean,
back
I
in a
think-
week.
Some way we don't want to lock ourselves in either.
Right.
If we make it too restrictive, then it's
You
less subjectivity.
Right, over
on
the
on
years
the
and
part
things.
of the board. The question I just
Sure.
had Chris, was, if a lot of times I want to do vertical integration along Highway 9 with the uses, how do I do that here?
What do you mean, how do you do it? It's
Well,
permitted.
It's permitted, but, so, will it restrict, like, what section is that? In other words, I have the chart.
You have the chart, which I believe is chart 9. Let me take off this clip. It's in the way of the chart number. Chart 9 talks about specific functions. So Highway 9 is really going to be primarily the T5 or T6. You'll notice that it allows you to do any of the uses, residential, lodging, office, or retail in the column on the right, anywhere within that district. They could be in the bottom floors, upper floors, or the like. Any other questions about the code, or do we want to go on to the TDR?
One question, maybe to bring back something you brought up, and procedurally, and we can discuss this more probably offline, but when we start getting some projects in under this, if we could maybe have some extra time with yourself beforehand, a little more time to review some of these, because it's a little more complex, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I know everyone's trying to get it into the cycle and get to this meeting so they can get to the next meeting, but these probably need maybe just a little bit more time.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to, especially with a commercial building, go, hey, move on to the next step, without some review,
Like,
And I don't know if there's a special review session that we have.
Longer work session, or we could just make everybody do a preliminary review?
It probably is wise. I mean, something that, is gonna, this much time put into it, may be prudent to spend a little more time on the review, especially for a commercial or a office building and such, that would, maybe it's, maybe there's a special review if something comes up, because it's not.
So the agenda would dictate it. The agenda would dictate it if you needed the extra time.
And I don't mind coming back a couple weeks later and doing it, but it just seemed like I agree.
Yeah.
That was one of the ideas I had about when we get together.
Breaking it up.
Right, when we get our design. I asked about just going to dinner afterwards. Us getting to where we could take somebody that is focusing on a particular project. We got 5 projects in front of us. We can divvy those up, and one person can look at that one project very seriously, and then come back when we have our work session. Then we can all enter into with the staff's comments, and I guess I'd assume you'd be staffed as well. So then we'd be a little bit better informed, because I felt uneasy at times looking at projects that I didn't think that I really grasped the whole concept of what we're really going to do. I mean, I understood what I looked at,
The
but
monkey project.
the monkey project's a perfect example. I'll leave it at that. But it still comes down to that somebody has to think through some of these things to make sure that we're not voting on something to agree to it or disagree, rightfully or unrightfully. It just seems like that we don't put the time to know all the details, and that we always know the devil's in the details.
I think actually in Sandy Springs, I think the planning commission works that way, where they divvy up, it could be the DRB, and they also have the DRB, that they divvy it up and give assignments to look, so, that's not unheard of, so.
Right. I got that idea from the Marietta City Council, because they did that a lot.
It would be nice to get to the point where we have enough things coming in to be able to have to divvy them up.
Well, things that are complicated, like on a commercial project or on I'll use apartment complexes or whatever it might be, that requires a lot more attention to detail to us than a single-story dock in a box.
Well, the senior living center, that whole Bethany Bend area, that's kind of a critical piece of land over there.
It is, and
It needs to be thought through pretty extensively.
And that was my point, because, on the design review board, because to your board, that, I asked the question about, does anybody consider traffic? Does anybody consider what's going to happen to this building 20 years down the line? Does anybody think about how, because really, we were just talking to a gentleman before he came in, the municipality is the one that has the obligation to enforce the right of quiet enjoyment, and for whatever the zoning may be. And so it's a big responsibility for a long period of time, and the city actually, or the municipality, has to take ownership of what they voted for 20 years ago. And the problem is, everything looks good when you build it in the first few years. You just got to ask the questions of what it's going to look like and what it's going to mean for us 20 years down the line.
Okay, well,
Okay.
do you have any more?
Marty?
Marty, yeah. Any other questions for Caleb before we move on to the TDR part? We can always come back if you think of anything else.
So, but just, could we, I know on the 26th, you guys are meeting, right? And you get to bless it and put the final words in. Would we be able to submit, after we have a little bit more time?
Yes.
To
Oh,
digest
absolutely.
this and
Absolutely.
get some comments back to you?
That's right. That's what the stakeholder committee did. We'd come to the stakeholder committee and we'd review it, and then they would give us comments, and then we would put them in, and then we'd have a new version that would come out.
Okay.
But yes, no, that's the purpose for tonight's meeting. And of course, the planning commission meeting is public, and you're welcome to come as well
Okay.
to speak. But the idea is, yes, to get as many review comments as possible. So please do that. This has been a very helpful discussion. You know, you all, both boards here have a role, so it's important that you're part of it. Okay, I'm going to, I see Rick is our TDR expert, and he has been working with us. He helped us develop the TDR ordinance for crabapple, and now he's working with us on the Deerfield. Rick is a national expert. He's literally written the books on TDR, and so we were really lucky to be able to get him to come help us. We just finished some of you might have heard that we rolled out the TDR program earlier this evening. We had about 130 people here to hear about what TDRs are and how people could use them on their land. And so we've started that discussion, and we've used it for crabapple, and now it's going to be embedded within the ordinance for Deerfield, should it be approved by everyone along the way. And then eventually, we're going to be doing a corridor study on Arnold Mill Road, and it's not inconceivable that we could have some TDR section within the Arnold Mill ordinance. We'll do a plan first, and then we'll go back and rezone the area, and it could also perhaps include a TDR. So TDR is a concept that is, Rick will tell you, is a great concept in terms of acquiring green space at no cost to the city, and it's been used across the country in many, many programs and been very successful, and it's a concept that the City Council has really asked us to look into and to implement. So with that, Rick Preetz from Orange County, California. There you are.
Thank you, Kathy. The transfer of development rights, or TDR, is a mechanism that's really a form of zoning that helps a community implement both its conservation as well as its development goals. And that's what it's proposed to do in the draft Deerfield form-based code, because there are open space areas that are designated in that form-based code, parks and greenways. But in addition, I'm hoping at least, that the TDR component of Deerfield will also coordinate with the crabapple TDR program to encourage voluntary preservation throughout the city. So I think all of you have heard the TDR 101 previously, but I'll refresh some of the buzzwords here. One thing to keep in mind is that TDR is completely voluntary, and one way of looking at it is that it allows property owners options within the zoning code. So, for example, the sending site, that's the word given to the areas that the community wants to conserve or to have less development on. And in this case, that's going to be parks and greenways or open space. And I'll get into details on that in a minute. The receiving site is basically the area where additional development is completely appropriate. So when I say it's voluntary, that means that in the sending site, that property owner doesn't have to record an easement, does not have to participate in the program if he or she chooses not to. However, when they do decide they want to participate, the following things happen. They record a conservation easement, a perpetual conservation easement, that permanently reduces the amount of development that can occur on that site, be it a park site, be it an open space site. The easement, once it's recorded, sets up and generates the TDRs as compensation for recording that easement, and the number of TDRs that you get is actually spelled out in the form-based code. The receiving site, developers have a choice. They can build up to what's called baseline with no TDR requirement, or they can exceed baseline and get bonus development, but only up to the maximum development allowed in the code by buying TDRs. And so when it works, the TDR program allows property owners to, in the case of open space sites, to retain their property, but yet to get cash, liquidate the unused development potential of that site. On the receiving site, it allows developers to get additional density and additional profits. So here it is played out within Deerfield. Deerfield, of course, here we're trying to use the form-based code and the TDR program to implement the LCI for Deerfield. And so we have those two kinds of sending sites, open space and parks and greenways, which I'll get into in a minute. However, as I already mentioned, we're also trying to make this program coordinate with the crabapple program and possibly subsequent programs so that it can preserve open space and parks and greenways throughout the city of Milton. So when owners apply for sending sites within the Deerfield area, the regulating plan itself actually identifies where those sites are going to be. The open space sites are the T2 zone, which Caleb already mentioned to you, within the Deerfield area, plus a little bit of a different twist that we didn't see in Crabapple is that there are two frontages along Bethany Bend and along Cogburn, is it? That, and I'll specify those exact areas in a minute, that are actually outside of the planning area, but which are of concern to some neighboring residents. So you have those open space sites, plus you have the civic space sites that are within the greenways. In other words, some of these areas that don't show up terribly well, but basically the olive areas and the trails that are marked on the map. So I've kept alluding to these two different types of sending areas. The open space site is an area where the property owners want to retain ownership of the underlying fee. However, they are willing to voluntarily record an easement that reduces their development potential. So in order to qualify within Deerfield, that's going to be a 2-acre lot as opposed to a 5-acre lot in Crabapple and throughout the rest of the city, with the exception of those two frontages. Sorry, this has gotten a little complicated. But elsewhere, it's a 5-acre minimum parcel site in order to qualify. And within Deerfield, it's simply the T2 zone. Outside of Deerfield, in other words, citywide, you actually apply and you justify it being a qualifying open space site based on the fact that it provides environmentally significant areas, agriculture, or rural character. Now, when a property owner decides they're going to participate in this program voluntarily, they record an easement that permanently reduces development potential on the site to 1 unit per parcel or 1 unit per 25 acres, whichever density is greater. The other kind of sending site is the Park Greenway site. Here, it's an area that is actually designated as a park, a greenway, a trail, a civic space on an adopted plan or code. Minimum 1 acre in size in order to qualify. So what does a property owner get in return for either providing this easement, recording this easement, or in fact deeding the property owner the property to the city in the case of a park and greenway site? Well, it's a formula that's right in the form-based code. You get one TDR for every, one TDR for every unconstrained acre, meaning a developable acre, or 1 TDR per every 4 constrained acres, constrained acre being land that's either wetlands or surface water, streams, stream buffers, and landfills. Plus, in order to encourage the owners of larger properties to participate, you have 1 TDR for every 5 acres of parcel size greater than 5 acres. If, in fact, that property owner is willing to deed the property over to the city as a park or a greenway or a trail, they get a bump. They get this formula times 1.25 for places that are identified as park or greenway sites. They get a 1.5 factor if it's designated as civic space. Here's an example of a 25-acre site that gets 17 TDRs for having 17 unconstrained acres. It gets 2 TDRs because it has 8 constrained acres, meaning wetlands or surface water. Plus, because it has 20 acres in excess of 5 acres, it gets another 4 TDRs for that, for a total of 23. Now, let's say this hypothetical site was going to become a park or a greenway. You would multiply by 1.25. The receiving areas are everything but the T2 in the Deerfield area, T3 through T6. Again, the developers have a choice here. They can build up to baseline, and those baselines are right in the form-based code, or they can gain 4 bonus dwelling units for every TDR that they acquire up to maximum, the maximum density that's spelled out for each of these 4 zones. So here's an example with the T4 zone. Baseline is 5 building units to the acre. A property owner, a developer can achieve that density without buying TDRs. In this particular zone, the maximum is 9 building units per acre. Since each TDR allows 4 additional building units per acre, a developer can buy 1 TDR and go from baseline up to the maximum amount of density allowed per acre. I alluded to the fact that we're trying to respond to some neighborhood concerns, and one of them is that this area here, which is already limited as a 2-story zone, is also cannot be considered as a receiving area under the TDR provisions of the form-based code. Also, some of the property owners were concerned, and this is how the 2-acre minimum lot size first developed, that within Deerfield, you've got the T2 zone. 2-acre lots would qualify as sending areas, but also there were some properties nearby that that residents in the area are concerned about at least offering for the TDR program, offering if the property owners are interested that they could become sending areas. And basically, those are the frontages on Bethany Road from Hopewell Road east to County Line and Cogburn Road from Devonshire Farms Way south to Bethany. And although it's totally impossible to see anything on this particular aerial, you can see why they have some concerns, because there are some nice, smaller but rural amenity type of properties along those 2 frontages. And that concludes my presentation. If you have some questions now.
I was just curious, so which comes first? You've given up your property, and then you got to hope you sell it? Is that what a lot of the concern was tonight? I mean, and then how are they buying it? Is it like a bidding war for everyone's TDR, or is there a standard price for a TDR? Or?
Well, 2 things. Let's start with the value. The value is for each TDR, you get 2 units. And a unit is worth either 1 housing unit or 2,250 square feet of commercial or office space. Now, there's a value to that. You know, so a developer can put an extra unit, build a residential unit, or you can put 2,250 square feet for each unit, and you get 2 units per TDR.
But the value is in the eyes of the developer. There
Yeah,
is no
so-
defined value.
Right, there's no
So the
defined
buyer's gotta
value,
make
but
it
you
yield.
at least have a
Yeah.
starting point in terms of what that is, so you have to negotiate.
So, but if you've got 500 TDRs up as available from 52 property owners, then is it like, then you go to an auction or something with your TDRs?
Well, you know,
How does that work?
and what we
Probably a
volunteer to
broker.
do is to put a list up there, listing on the website, willing sellers and willing buyers. Now, what people got confused with tonight is that they thought they had to actually sign away their development rights
Well, that was
with
my
an
other question.
easement in order to be eligible to even negotiate with the
Right.
developer. We said, hold it, wait a minute, you know, you don't have to get that far along. You need to come up with a contractual option or something with the developer so that
Yes, you
you're
might want
not-
to make that more clear in that presentation, because it looks like first, you will relinquish all
Yeah,
rights to your
well,
property, and
and
then
that's
hope
not the
you can
case.
sell your TDR.
You can do it first.
You could, right.
Yeah, but.
You
it's
lose a
like
little
it's-
leverage in your
Use a
bargain.
little leverage.
Sure, but you
So,
could.
so the idea is that you find a willing developer and you develop an option
Gotcha.
that's pretty iron tight, and then you enter, you know, into your conservation easement.
gotcha.
So what
It
you're-
it
what-
needs to
Closing.
follow.
What it really
So-
comes down to is somebody buying
Yeah.
a lot, even though they're not gonna use it. The
Yes.
developer gives a lot
Yeah.
to the city in
Yeah.
terms of easement
Yeah.
to, so it's,
Is it an easement? I'm trying to figure out now. It's an
Can be.
easement over the property, correct?
Yes.
Forever.
Forever, but the easement basically, you have eliminated your possibility of developing it.
Well, no, first of all, it allows uses allowed in the Ag 1 zone.
Yes.
And
Oh,
you
it
take,
does?
you take, yes. You can have agriculture, horse-related industries, whatever's allowed in the Ag 1.
But you can't, under the Ag 1, you can still build homes on a 25-acre property theoretically. you could get-
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't finish. Plus, you're taking the density down to either 1 per 25 acres or
Got it.
1 per parcel if your parcel's smaller than 25 acres.
So is the easement, it's just an easement that preserves the area, but it's not for public use?
That's under the open space option. That's where the property owner retains the underlying fee ownership.
Yeah.
Then you've got this other option that's available to property owners if their land is actually designated as a park or greenway site.
Okay. You
If
get
they
more.
say, you know, I just
You
as
get more
soon,
TDRs.
I just as soon deed this property over to the city as a park, they get TDRs for that. They get a higher ratio for doing that.
Got it.
So the city would pay you for that, those TDRs?
No, you
No,
it'd be
you
the developer.
No.
A
It's almost
developer would buy the TDRs and it
Work
would
out
get
a deal to
conveyed
make a
to
park.
the city
I
for a
gotcha.
park.
Yes, that's right.
See,
Rob,
there's-
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Marie.
I have a quick question, that kind of reminded me, somebody had a question for me, because there are other uses allowed in AG1, like a vet clinic, a landscaping business, things that are productive in the sense that it makes money. So have we addressed that? I mean, we talk about single family, we talk about horses and just the general agricultural, but how do we address something like that?
Are those allowed by right, or are they allowed by conditional use
Well, vet
permit?
clinic is allowed by right, a kennel, a vet clinic, a nursery, I mean, we have nurseries that produce and grow things and sell things. Now, a landscaping business is by a use permit, we allow a bed and breakfast by a use permit, so it's a combination.
Mhm. Well, right now, the way the easement reads, the draft easement, is that you can have those uses in the, if there's any question as to whether the use in the Ag 1 would mar either the agricultural intent, the environmental resources, or the rural character, they may not be able to have that. That's one of the provisions in the current draft, and I can see that something like a full-blown nursery on what would be considered to be currently a rural property could be perceived by people as not being what they wanted out of this program.
So it's just something to think about.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Marty, did you have a question?
No, I was just gonna say, it's almost like banks buying community reinvestment. bank, you know. Some banks have a lot more community reinvestment loans than other banks, and so banks will take and buy them up, like the big banks will buy them up. And that's essentially what this is. You know, somebody's got land, the developer needs extra density, so he goes over here and pays the right to put it into community, the property and community trust, or whatever you want to call it, and he gets to put up higher density. So he's basically buying for more density and
Right.
more square foot
without having to rezone.
without rezone.
Or
There
buy
you
more
go.
property.
And the thing is, there's no city money involved, and the city gets the green space, and the seller gets some money, and the developer gets his units. So it really is quite a good program in that
What's the
sense.
tax treatment on the proceeds? Like a
They're taxed.
Sale of land?
Yeah, they're taxed. Right.
If property's in conservation, you can't do that, right? You can't do this.
If you've got that 10-year conservation easement on it, we talked about that, and we thought you could.
You can't sell it, how could you do that?
Because you're keeping the fee on it,
You're
you're
just
not
doing
selling
that.
it.
You're just
There's no
doing
title change.
an easement.
That's true, there's no title
Yeah.
change. but-
Are we going to include
Hire a good
the
real estate attorney, we'll figure it out.
provision to at least
Yeah.
establish a bank
And a good
if
tax
the council
attorney.
decides in the future they want to do that, or are we not even going to address it?
Do we have in
We
here
got it in
about the bank?
Crabapple, I thought.
I believe it allows the city to form a bank, but doesn't require it.
Okay.
Yeah, that was in the crab
It's in
apple
Crabapple.
overlay.
Yeah. Is it in this one, or with the crab apple
I
one?
don't remember seeing it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not just for here, but,
Part of it is
statewide,
business.
What?
act as a
TDRs.
brokerage
Yeah.
statewide for TDRs.
My real estate days are over.
Any more, is this clear? I mean, for those of you who've heard it the first time, it might not be so clear. Some of us have heard it like 8 times, so.
I mean, I
you
get
know,
it.
You know, it's a simple concept. It has some technicalities involved that can get it a little into the weeds, but it doesn't cost the city any, rather than the city using bond funds or its general revenue to buy open space or
Is it there?
what, it's a way of, is it in there?
Well, it doesn't use the word bank, but it says the city of Milton may, but is not obligated to buy, hold, and resell TDRs.
Oh, okay.
And once you get it all set up, do a reverse mortgage and not tell the other guy. Run out of
Did you have a
loans.
question, Karen? No? Okay. Anybody have any other questions? We can even open it up to the form-based code if you'd like to go back to that. Now, are you planning to be at the planning commission meeting, Caleb? You, Caleb?
Yeah, the one on the 26th?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be
Okay,
back.
So Caleb will be there. Rick will not be back in town until the work session for the city council. But he's always accessible through me, or through Michelle or Robin. We can email him if you have any questions or any comments on the TDR part. But we use him judiciously because of his distance. But he will be back in person in March, but accessible through email. But Caleb will see for the planning commission meeting, right? And you're all invited, it's a public meeting. George will chair it.
Yeah.
And,
I would, let's see, I guess if you do, I know this is very short notice, if you have any comments, I would love if you could give them to Kathy this week, because I'm going on vacation next week for 2.5 weeks, and I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I could probably make them, but we try to have versions to the planning commission. I guess I could make them that Friday.
Well,
Well, even
even
if
if it
not,
comes
if you've got
afterwards.
if you've got comments, try and get them to the planning commission.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, or that too,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Either
I
way.
mean,
I'm going to make the
or-
architectural changes, because I sort of know what I want to do there, but anything else, yeah, we can certainly do that and make a bigger,
And then George brought up the issue, if we look at doing the single-family homes, do we need any architectural guidelines for that?
probably, yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
Oh.
that's
So much for vacation,
a- no, I'm
So, you know, do what you can this week, but if it has to wait till you get back, I mean, we've got plenty of time, it's not going that fast then.
Is the TDR citywide, or is it just in Crabapple and then it'll be in
In
here?
terms of the receiving areas, they're only in Crabapple and in Deerfield. But the sending areas is all AG1 all
Okay.
over the city. That's how it works. Okay?
As long as it fits the criteria.
Right.
Yeah, has to fit the criteria.
A semi-vertical space.
Your air
I'll
rights.
go up at least like a couple of miles.
Did anyone have any issues with the height? Because we had a lot of discussion in the stakeholder committee
Curious,
meeting. But based on what they've got existing in terms of entitlement for height and what Alpharetta has put in place, we felt that we were being fair.
I have a question, hypothetical. If there is an office building, say, in Deerfield, office site with current use zone, could that owner do a TDR, come back and say, instead of so many square feet, now I've bought some TDRs and I can go higher, or I can get more
Density.
square feet
Yeah.
density?
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Would they have to go through a rezone, or would they just say?
No, it's built in here. It's built in here. It says
As
right.
long as they're within their maximum.
It's
density.
right in here. It
Right, I
gives you
understand, but-
baseline and it gives you the
It's a pretty
TDR.
large jump.
And you can go for either, or you can go for part more TDR. You don't have to go the whole max.
Yeah.
But it's all built, it's right in here. It's already given.
Where they, apartments have, I mean.
Time out. I want to make sure I understand the question, because if what you're suggesting is that they get approved today, for example, and then come back and want to increase the height once this is approved.
Yes.
I think they would have to go through a rezoning.
Oh.
Because they're not
That was
getting
my-
approved
yeah.
under this.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I thought
Yeah.
you meant under this. No, I mean, right now, like the property
Oh, yeah,
next
yeah,
door,
yeah.
where that to be, any
Apartments.
rezoning that goes on right now has to be under the current zoning. I mean, this,
No,
until this.
I
They wouldn't get
said-
the extra automatically. They'd have to come back
Yeah.
again to get that.
Okay, that was my question. Current zoning, okay, say it's
Yeah.
50,000 square foot building. Bought some TDRs, and would they have to go through the rezone process to get
To
more?
apply them to what they'd
Yes.
already been approved for, yeah,
They would.
yeah. Because they're
Between-
basically
Between
getting.
now and March, though, I mean, once this is
Yeah.
passed.
No, I'm talking next year sometime.
Yeah.
Oh, next,
No.
This
You're
is
talking
gonna
about
be
you-
done in March.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
understand.
next,
2 months.
next
No, I
year,
mean, I
no.
understand.
Yeah.
They
So-
would
You're talking
come
maybe
back
about a
and-
four-story building
No,
down
no,
on
not-
Morris that wants to bump up to 12.
No, I'm talking about, let's just, in June, somebody says, I've got a site in Deerfield, 20,000 square foot building. I bought some TDRs. We've already done the TDR program. I want to bump this up to 30,000. Would they have to go through a rezone?
No,
No.
No.
no. It's all entitled in here.
Got it. Interesting.
Now, they would, depending on how it's enforced, they might lose some leniency that they have under their vested zoning today, because this is crafted in such a way that a lot of these properties are zoned for much more right than they actually have built on them.
Uh-huh.
So, if you had a good zoning attorney, they could probably argue that as long as, if they're vested and they change it to comply with the new code, they might actually lose stuff, even though they're getting more density.
That's what I was about to say, because if it's more than.
'Cause they'd have to meet all the
substantial
architecture
change, yeah,
and-
then it
and
triggers
everything.
everything else in here.
By just adding the TDRs?
If it's a substantial modification. I would
Yeah, I
think
mean,
it would be.
it's a city attorney and
Well, it doesn't we're not dealing with the TDRs, we're just dealing with the rezoning.
Yeah.
When this new zoning comes in, all the requirements in here
Got it.
come into being. Whether it's baseline or TDR,
Yeah.
they still have to meet all these requirements.
But if they want to change it and build something that is different,
Different.
because their site plans are pretty specific and they're conditioned on the
Correct.
site plan, so
Right.
they
Yeah.
have to comply with the new code.
Right.
We did create a provision, I don't know if those of you who have read it, we know that apartments are an extremely sensitive issue here, so the way I handled them is they are subject to a use permit, and they have to do some pretty specific design standards, meaning they can't be only apartments, they have to have a certain amount of commercial in them. This was really to address the issues that came up right next door during the rezoning. We wanted to be proactive, so that would have to go through the process.
And that's gonna come before the planning commission in the next rotation. It'll go to you in February.
The use permit standards? Okay.
So it'll be concurrent.
Any other questions before we adjourn? Thank you. This has been a great meeting.
Really good, yeah.
Thank you for your
Appreciate you
time.
coming.
Especially compared to the last one.
Oh, I know, my goodness, that was really quite a meeting. Thank you, Caleb, thank you, Rick.
Barely made it.
Well,
I
delighted
left
that you came.
Midtown at 5:05, and I got here at 6:50. Traffic was so bad.
That would be interesting is what developers are really going to value a TDR at.
Right.
Yes.
For whatever it's worth, Caleb, I left downtown at 5 and I got here at 6.
Really?
Yeah, the first
It's
one.
about an hour.
You know, that
With
was
no-
my
no
office.
I take the
previous-
train
You have to go left, the whole interstate comes to a local street, everyone has to turn left.
Farmer is a winner, developer's a winner, and the city's
Yes,
a winner.
and that's where it was too. But you'll be fine.
Yeah, that's Rick. Hey, Rick, what communities in Florida?
Some of the things, I mean, I know Kathy likes that vertical
Yeah.
integration.
Humboldt County,
I need to sink my teeth into something. So when people come in and challenging us all the time.
It's not mandatory, but it's
I know,
it's
she really
permitted.
wants it. So is there a way in the intent, we could say, well, the intent is to do something like that? So that we could say, well, look, it's in the intent. Because people will say to me, geez, it's not in here. I know it's permitted, but it's not part of you, so where am I required? I don't wanna do it. And they don't wanna integrate like retail into housing areas.
Well, there is the retail and the housing.
Like, seriously.
There is that. That is,
And it's not vertical. It's
it
just
can be
retail.
vertical or horizontal. Yeah, I'll show you where it
Oh,
is.
show me that. So I haven't read it
I
all.
would actually,
I will read it all
I would
this
recommend
week.
not making it mandatory, and we've had so many projects that have died because they can't get financing for it. Because of and they're not lying.
And they're not,
No, they're really not.
they're all saying the same thing. Saying, Bob, I can't get financing for it.
So
I won't
what
do it."
what I did, where is
Just
it?
where would
It's under, it should be back here, building special requirements, placement. Okay, here we go. Apartments, which also mean condos, it means any more than 3 units, shall only be permitted subject to a use permit. They buildings have to have the entire first story for non-residential, okay? Or on sites where you have at least 50% of the floor area dedicated to other use. So that would be the,
So that's how you did that.
that would be the,
That's how I can get, yeah, okay.
because 50% is a lot.
That's a lot, yeah, but it's in there, something.
But it gives them the ability, if they wanted to, they could theoretically do a 100,000 square foot office building, a 100,000 square foot
Right,
multifamily.
okay.
But
All right,
they're
it's
not
good.
gonna
So
do
that's
that.
where it is. All right, I'll know where it is.
Okay.
Yeah, appreciate it. That's why I know where to flip to, because I get challenged every day. And we're doing pretty good. Crab apples doing great.
Yeah, it was,
They're actually liking it.
I heard.
Prices are coming up.
I heard.
They're really doing well there, right? We've been very successful in crab apple.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's been, I'm telling you, once this gets implemented, you're gonna see development start to take off
We'll get it
much
in,
more.
I think,
I hope so, yes.
What are these for?
I'm wanting ones for Highway 9.
As opposed to the M&Ms?
Tomorrow.
Did you ever hear the story about?
Actually, I have to take out the
M&Ms, and people started eating them after they had put their hands.
Oh, yeah, the green one needs to go here.
Yeah, okay, good. All right, yeah, thanks for coming.
I warn you, when you use those blocks, bring a digital camera and take pictures.
Okay, that's
To
cool.
document each
Oh,
one.
but you
Yeah.
haven't heard about the piece de resistance that we're trying to get through. Hopefully Chris will allow us to do it. We are working a deal with Legos, as in Denmark, to, for National Planning Month, we're gonna get all the students, or up to 1,000 students, because they will send us Legos for 1,000 students to build cities of the future. And, so.
I want to go.
Well, this will be at the APA conference in Atlanta, right? It'll be
No,
here.
we're gonna do it we're gonna do it this October.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you were doing something for the
Well,
APA
well, we were
conference.
thinking that, but we'd rather do something for Milton.
Okay.
So we're going to, so hopefully we
that'd
can
be
pull
nice.
this off.
Those will be nice. That'd be
Well,
fun.
yeah, that's great to have.
Anyway, but that's just something to think about.
I didn't realize that. I heard something about it, but.
Yeah, and, yeah, we're in, Legos willing to do it. And they're in Denmark.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
use this all over Europe.
I've seen some stuff.
In there. When I was in high school, I was an exchange student in Denmark, and I have slides, so I'll have to convert them to pictures, JPEGs, that we can show them.
I will be on my plane to Europe this week next
Ooh,
time.
you're really
Oh, good
going
for you,
in.
good for you. Yes, well, have a wonderful time. I hope the weather,
I've been checking, I added Naples, it looks, it's pretty,
Okay.
I mean, it's tropical there usually, so.
good.
High 70s. so.
Oh, God.
Oh, that's good, yeah, it's like Mediterranean.
I mean, they have palm trees, it doesn't get.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
So,
All right, well,
anyway, I'll
thank
make
you
those
all.
changes, and,
Okay.
that your flash drive?
Oh, yes, yeah. Those are ours.
The ones they brought? Okay.
Yeah, those are the ones I brought. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
But yeah, I'll,
Yeah, those need to go back to the, cover. All right, yeah, just crop something. That's, all right.
you don't need to get Lou Oliver involved.
No, we're not, no.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Enjoy them.
Yeah, so,
What do you say?
do you think the store is open? Okay.
Oh, I don't know.
We'll have to
He's protective of his wall.
I know, people like.
They're laid out, so each one of those bags has 2 groups.
I got that one.
So each bag is really 2 tables.
Okay.
They're in Kroger bags and stuff.
Oh, I see, all right. So we have to make sure that nobody steals these.
Okay. Because she turned it out.
Oh, that way, oh, I didn't realize that was two. Okay, so, okay. Oh, there's a,
I didn't ask your mom.
you have a tablet, don't you? Yeah, you could just, wow, I thought it was.
Heavy?
Yeah. Oh, I have it, you gotta carry it.
Yeah, you just carry some.
Old fashioned, blank, yeah, what she had to play with before smartphones and tablets. Right, this is what, yeah.
What normal kids play with, or old fashioned kids, or.
These are what?
Blocks, our building blocks.
Build stuff.
That's what we're gonna do tomorrow, is
I
play.
still use them. Who still doesn't use them?
They still
We
do,
go
but not
out,
as much as they
we
used
do
to.
backside.
So, okay, so that goes off.
Yeah, I've checked it